Greetings, my dear viewer. My name is Anthony, and today I'll tell you a story about marital infidelity. The main character, named Matthew, finds himself in a fierce showdown with his wife's affair partner. Who will emerge victorious from this situation? Let's find out. And while you're listening, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your fantastic like. While traveling for work, I always felt a persistent longing for home, even amidst the thrill of taking on new assignments. My mind often wandered to Emily, my wife, especially when the days on the road seemed endless. It was the simple moments I craved, our quiet movie nights, a casual dinner at our favorite restaurant, small rituals that anchored me and restored my sense of normalcy. My latest trip had been demanding, but I managed to wrap up sooner than expected. The project in Orlando had gone smoothly, and I couldn't wait to surprise Emily by returning early. Just picturing her reaction made the long hours worthwhile. As I climbed the stairs at home, envisioning our evening together, I glanced up to see a figure, someone holding a tool, standing at the top. Before I could fully process what was happening, a blinding flash erupted, and I felt myself tumbling backward down the stairs. Everything faded into darkness. When I regained consciousness, I was lying in an unfamiliar bed, surrounded by shadows and distant voices. I tried to move, but even the slightest shift felt like a monumental task. Straining to listen, I soon recognized Emily's voice. She was speaking with a man, though I could only see his back. "What did the doctor say?" the man asked softly. "Matthew's showing signs of improvement, but he's still in critical condition," Emily replied with a tremor in her voice. Realizing they were discussing me, I tried to understand what was going on. Emily sounded tense, urging the man to leave. "Aiden, you really shouldn't be here," she whispered, almost pleading. "Does he remember anything?" he asked, sounding concerned. "I don't know," she responded, a hint of fear in her tone. "He's not alert enough to talk to the detective yet." She insisted he leave, and as she spoke, my eyelids fluttered open briefly. Emily was standing alone by the window. I wasn't certain if the man was real or a figment of my groggy mind, and I lacked the strength to ask. The next time I opened my eyes, sunlight was pouring into the room. Emily remained by the window, her face streaked with the evidence of recent tears. I shifted slightly, noticing another man in the room, a vaguely familiar figure with curly brown hair, wearing a worn suit. Unnerved, I closed my eyes, feigning sleep to avoid interaction. When I finally looked again, night had fallen, and the room was empty. Left alone, I tried to make sense of my surroundings. It hit me. I was in a hospital, though I couldn't recall why or how long I'd been there. Gradually, memories began to resurface. I remembered returning from Orlando, setting my bags down, heading upstairs, and then the man at the top of the stairs. I recalled the flash, the loud noise, and the sensation of falling, but beyond that, everything felt blurred, glimpses of Emily crying and the possible presence of a stranger questioning me. The lines between reality and dreams were difficult to discern. Emily returned later, looking exhausted, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with redness. She came close, holding my hand and gently kissing my forehead. "Emily, are you all right?" I asked, startled by the frail tone of my voice. "You seem so tired." Her voice was barely a whisper as she confessed, "I couldn't sleep. I was terrified of losing you." Her eyes filled with emotion. "But the doctor says you're going to be okay. You're expected to make a full recovery." I blinked, trying to grasp my surroundings. "How long have I been here?" "Since Friday," she replied gently. "What day is it now?" I asked, still feeling disoriented. "It's Tuesday," she answered softly. 3 days had vanished. I stared at the ceiling, attempting to process the lost time. 3 days. Just gone. I murmured. She leaned in, her expression filled with concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "I think I'm a bit clearer now, but it's strange. I don't feel much else," I replied, still struggling to understand everything. "What exactly happened?" I asked, the confusion lingering. Emily's expression tightened, her eyes clouded with worry. "You don't remember?" she asked, a note of apprehension in her voice. "Only fragments," I admitted. But before we could continue, another familiar voice interrupted us. Detective Gonzalez was the first to break the silence, volunteering to give a rundown of the events. Sitting next to Emily, he introduced himself calmly. "I'm Detective Alexander Gonzalez. I'll be handling your case." He began recounting what had happened. "On Friday, after you got back from Orlando, you walked into a burglary in progress. The intruder shot you 3 times, chest and abdomen, as you came up the stairs. Emily here found you, called for help, and you're lucky in 2 ways," he went on. "First, the gun was a small caliber. Second, Emily's quick action saved your life." Emily's hand in mine was a reassuring presence, though my mind spun with questions. "Do you know who did this?" I asked. Gonzalez paused, considering his response. "There's been a string of break-ins in the area, but this is the first one with a shooting. Hopefully the shooter left something behind that will help us track him down." Detective Gonzalez leaned forward and asked if I recalled any details, but my mind was blank beyond the shadowy figure on the stairs with a gun in hand. "You might remember more as time passes," he assured me, promising to return the following day. Once the detectives left, I turned to Emily, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you for saving me." Tears filled her eyes as she kissed me gently. "I can't imagine my life without you," she whispered. A chilling thought crossed my mind, and I looked at her, horrified. If I hadn't been the one to walk in, it could have been you. She hugged me tightly, and we cried together, both shaken by how close we'd come to tragedy. A nurse entered with pain medication, and I drifted into a heavy sleep. When I woke again, Emily was by the window, reading. I asked, "Do you know what they stole?" Her face fell. "I haven't been back to the house since it happened. The police are still investigating, and I couldn't bear to go back after what I saw." "I understand," I replied quietly. "We'll deal with it when this is all over." Emily stayed close by, and we steered clear of discussing that awful night. When she finally left, I lay in the stillness, thinking of how close I'd come to losing everything, especially her. I tried to recall more fragments from that night, hoping to remember something useful for Detective Gonzalez when he came back. Another dose of pain medication put me to sleep. By morning, I felt a bit stronger, though I still couldn't move as I wanted. Emily gave me a kiss before heading to work, promising to return soon. When the doctor visited, he asked how I was doing. "All things considered, not bad," I replied. "But why can't I move my arms and legs?" He explained, "After surgery, we needed to keep you as still as possible to prevent further injury. You're fortunate. The bullets didn't hit any major organs." He added that I might be able to go home by Monday, though it would be a few weeks before I could get back to work. Emily, clearly relieved, kissed me goodbye and left, saying she'd return later. After she left, a nurse adjusted my restraints, allowing me a bit more movement. Watching pigeons flutter by outside the window, I saw Detective Gonzalez step into the room. "Feeling any better?" he asked, taking a seat beside me. "I think so," I replied. Actually, something came to mind last night. The shooter. He held the gun in his left hand and wore a black ring, maybe onyx, on his middle finger. "That's useful information," he said, jotting it down. "A left-handed shooter with an onyx ring. It gives us a solid lead." We chatted briefly, and I noticed he was still wearing the same worn suit. He shrugged when he saw me looking and explained that a fire had recently destroyed his wardrobe, leaving him with just this one. Before he left, Detective Gonzalez told me something deeply unsettling. The gunman hadn't just wanted me dead, he wanted me to suffer slowly. That's why he'd aimed at my stomach instead of going for a lethal headshot. Gonzalez assured me he'd uncover the reason behind the attack. He then began asking probing questions about my job and coworkers, subtly implying that someone close to me could be involved. It wasn't until later, after he'd gone, that the weight of his words truly sank in. Over the next few days, as my strength returned, I started walking slowly through the hospital hallways, supported by the staff. Emily was always there for me. Every morning she came without fail, and often she'd return after work to sit by my side until visiting hours ended. The nights were lonely, so I'd call her, and our late-night conversations, sometimes stretching over half an hour, became my anchor. As my recovery continued, I noticed changes in Emily too. She looked worn down, her skin pale, and she'd noticeably lost weight. Seeing her like that hurt, but I kept faith that things would improve once we finally got back home. At night, memories from our early days together drifted into my mind. We'd first crossed paths at a college party, though back then she hadn't made much of an impression on me. But 2 weeks later, fate intervened, and we met again. This time she greeted me with a warm smile, and that changed everything. Our first date soon followed, and within a week, we were inseparable. These memories sustained me in the hospital. Emily and I had shared 9 years of marriage, and our recent trip to Orlando had been only the second time we'd been apart since we'd tied the knot. The first had been years back when she accompanied a student group to Germany, a trip I couldn't join because of work. I missed her terribly during both separations, and when she returned from Germany, I arranged a special dinner to welcome her back. It was a perfect night, and she'd brought me a unique German beer stein as a gift, which became a cherished addition to my collection. That evening and her thoughtful gift reminded me of just how fortunate I was to have her. By Monday, I felt well enough to go home. Emily took the day off, arriving bright and early to help me pack up. On the drive home, Emily explained we'd be staying with her parents for a while since our house was still being cleaned. A cleaning crew was scheduled for that day, but I insisted on checking things out myself, in case anything needed to be reported to our insurance. Emily grew tense, her silence hinting at her unease about what I might find inside. When we neared the house, I suggested we enter through the front door to avoid the stairs in the garage. She helped me out of the car, and together we made our way inside. As soon as we stepped through the door, the sharp scent of metal and copper hit me. My suitcase lay nearby, alongside another bag, both stained with blood beside a large dried pool on the floor. The sight and smell were overwhelming. Emily ran to the bathroom, overcome by nausea. When she returned, I guided her to the family room, hoping to help her relax on the couch. Looking around, I noticed a few items scattered about, and one glaring absence. My German beer stein was missing. I started to wonder if a theft had taken place, but Emily interrupted, apologizing for her reaction to the blood. She insisted on making me lunch and settling me into bed, though I wasn't quite ready to tackle the stairs yet. I suggested she leave me a sandwich and head back to work so she wouldn't have to deal with the cleaning crew's arrival. Reluctantly, she agreed, quickly made me a meal, and left. An hour later, the cleaners arrived, and I let them in. They immediately got to work, scrubbing away the bloodstains. While they worked, I checked the safe hidden in a cabinet above the fireplace. Thankfully, everything was in place, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Exhausted, I decided to leave the remaining cleanup for another day and stretched out on the couch to rest. By the time Emily returned home, a cinnamon scent filled the air, and the foyer looked spotless. Despite the fresh atmosphere, Emily appeared even more anxious. She poured herself a generous glass of whiskey, drinking it in one go, then started to cry softly, wishing aloud that all of this would simply vanish. I tried to comfort her, assuring her that the police would eventually catch the person responsible, but my words seemed to do little to ease her fears. That night, for the first time in weeks, We lay down in the same bed, but neither of us could find sleep. Each time I stirred, feeling as though I'd heard something, I saw Emily awake, gazing into the darkness. By Tuesday, things began looking up. I felt stronger, managing the stairs on my own, and enjoyed breakfast with Emily before she left for work. Once alone, I busied myself with tidying up the kitchen. Later that morning, Detective Gonzalez stopped by to check in and asked if I'd noticed anything missing. While we talked, I brewed coffee and he casually asked, "Did you make a list of what's gone?" I admitted that I hadn't yet done that. Taking in the disorderly scene, I assured Gonzalez nothing seemed to be missing. "Are you certain?" he asked, a hint of surprise lacing his words. "Yes," I confirmed, though a nagging feeling lingered. "But I'm convinced more than one person was involved in this." With a nod, Gonzalez, now suggesting I call him Alexander, encouraged me to share my theory. I explained how it looked like whoever ransacked the first floor left in a rush after gunshots rang out. Curiously, they hadn't even touched high-value items like the TV or attempted to open the safe. Alexander listened, considering the possibility that the gunfire had startled them. Yet he also wasn't ready to dismiss other possible motives. Accepting my offer for coffee, he joined me in the family room, where we began analyzing the situation together. Staring at the chaos, I finally voiced the question that had been haunting me. "Do you think the shooter might return?" I asked. Alexander paused, then replied thoughtfully, "There's always a chance, but it's doubtful. He knows you didn't see his face, and returning would only heighten his risk." I mentioned how Emily was still uneasy about the possibility of another break-in. Alexander offered to arrange extra patrols in our area, easing some of my concerns. As our conversation drifted, I inquired about his family. Alexander opened up, sharing that his wife had recently forgiven him after he narrowly avoided a mistake with another woman, and things were finally looking up for them. When he left, I attempted to clean up the house, though my weakened state made it a slow task. The most difficult part was picking up shards from a beer stein Emily had gifted me from Germany. It was the only item broken, but it felt like a personal loss. Upstairs, nothing had been touched. Emily's jewelry was exactly where she'd left it, leading me to believe I'd managed to scare off the intruders before they ventured beyond the first floor. That evening, when Emily returned, she noticed the tidiness and scolded me for overdoing it. I reassured her I was fine. Later, she gently helped me to bed, changed my bandages, and seemed relieved to find no sign of infection. As I drifted to sleep, Emily soothed my shoulders with a gentle massage. The next morning, she mentioned an open house at school. I encouraged her to go, though I could see worry still etched in her eyes as she hugged me tightly before heading out. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," I responded, watching her leave. Once alone, the quiet settled heavily around me. I wanted to keep busy, but after yesterday's effort, I knew it was better to rest. I promised both Emily and myself I'd take it easy, put on some music, and immersed myself in a Dean Koontz novel I'd picked up recently. I spent the day reading, pausing briefly for lunch, until Emily came back home. She was glad to see I hadn't pushed myself too hard, though she teased me lightly about skipping a nap. When she left for the open house, I tried watching TV but grew restless with the reruns. My thoughts wandered back to the burglary, haunted by unanswered questions. How did they leave empty-handed? And how had they managed to break in undetected? I felt an urge to recheck the safe. Upon opening it, I sifted through the items until I found something I'd missed earlier, a pair of $300 American Airlines vouchers. A suspicion began to creep over me as I pondered the discovery. Emily? I wondered if she had been upstairs with the intruder during the attack. Though a surge of anger bubbled up, I chose to remain calm and gather more information. Realizing a confrontation might be premature, I called my close friend Jim Culkin, a lawyer, to share what I'd found. He promised to come over the next morning. Then I contacted Detective Alexander Gonzalez, asking him to stop by that night at 9. By 8:50, as I was scribbling notes and mapping out my thoughts, Emily arrived home. When she asked about my writing, I brushed it off as nothing significant, casually mentioning Jim and Alexander's upcoming visit. Emily seemed curious about Jim's arrival but reacted with visible concern when I mentioned Alexander. She asked if there was any news regarding the intruder, to which I replied that we'd soon find out. She excused herself to go upstairs and change, leaving me to rein in my frustration. I knew I had to stay composed until I heard what Jim and Alexander had to say. Jim showed up right at 9, glancing at me with a quick, appraising look. Emily came down shortly after, warmly greeting Jim with a hug and a peck on the cheek. Before we could delve into conversation, the doorbell chimed once more. Alexander had arrived. After introductions wrapped up, Alexander showed a faint curiosity about Jim's role there. Trying to keep the atmosphere light, I explained that Jim was merely observing. Satisfied, Alexander didn't press for details, and we all moved into the family room, where coffee was ready. Emily helped me distribute it, and as everyone got comfortable, I prompted Alexander to elaborate on the update he'd mentioned over the phone. Alexander started, revealing that earlier that day, several robbers had been arrested, suspected of having a link to my shooting. But there was a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, lining his words. Noticing this, I leaned in and asked, "Do you actually believe these are the people who attacked me?" Alexander paused, admitting quietly, "To be honest, I'm not certain." Before I could respond, Emily tightened her grip on my arm, her face taut with worry. "Do you know who did this to you?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. I shook my head, replying softly, "No, I don't." Still, I felt that perhaps I could aid Alexander in piecing together the clues. Jim listened intently as I explained my suspicions, mentioning the American Airlines vouchers I'd recently stumbled upon in our safe, along with scattered flashes of that day's events. I recalled arriving home at precisely 12:15 to find everything in order on the first floor. The mess had appeared only after the shooting, suggesting that the intruder hadn't been downstairs when I first entered. As I spoke, Emily's complexion grew visibly paler. "Matthew, what are you suggesting?" she whispered, a tremor in her voice. I pressed on, speculating that the shooter had likely been waiting upstairs and later staged the main floor to look like a robbery. Meeting Alexander's gaze, I added, "I believe Emily knows who was behind the shooting and the reason why." To my surprise, Alexander nodded in agreement. "I've had the same thoughts," he admitted. "I'll need to bring her in for questioning." I asked Alexander if he'd allow Jim, as her attorney, to speak with her first. He agreed, adding that if Emily refused to come in voluntarily, they'd have to issue a warrant. Once Alexander departed, Jim assured me that any conversation with Emily would remain confidential. I nodded, assuring him that I simply wanted her to have someone trustworthy nearby. Jim went to speak with her privately while I waited upstairs. Roughly 20 minutes later, he called me down, mentioning that Emily wanted to gather a few things before leaving. Jim headed to his office as Emily collected her belongings upstairs. I yearned to know whether Emily had decided to cooperate with the police, yet I knew better than to press Jim directly. He'd share what he could, leaving me to piece together the rest. Sitting at my desk, I wrestled with the unfolding reality. Had I overlooked warning signs in our relationship? The idea of Emily being involved with someone else seemed unbelievable, though the evidence hinted otherwise. It became evident that Alexander's suspicions had surfaced long before mine. Could Emily be entangled in an affair? Had this supposed lover of hers been the one who pulled the trigger? The thought of her delaying the emergency call by 8 critical minutes clawed at me, raising the terrifying possibility that she'd hoped I wouldn't survive. Reconciling the woman I loved with a potential role in such a dark plot was a bitter weight to carry. Tears pricked my eyes just as Jim appeared in the doorway. "Matthew, we're leaving. You said you'd call Emily's father, right?" "Yes, I'll do that now," I replied, steadying myself. After Jim and Emily left, I mustered the courage to call her father George. Carefully, I laid out what had transpired and asked him to support her during this difficult time. George reacted with shock, refusing to believe Emily could be involved, but I explained that she would be staying with him and Mary for a while. After ending the call, I sank back into my chair, the gravity of the situation settling over me. Questions raced through my mind. Had this all been part of a scheme? How long could her affair have been going on? The notion that her lover might have been my assailant played over and over in my mind. To calm my nerves, I took a painkiller and eventually drifted into a troubled sleep. By the next morning, I awoke with a hollow ache, angry at Emily's actions but equally yearning for her presence. The phone rang off and on, calls from her school, her mother, and some unknown numbers that left no message. I couldn't shake the possibility that one of Emily's recent calls might have been with her lover. Then, right at 5 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Alexander. We exchanged a few polite words before he invited himself over for a drink. Once he arrived, Alexander shared that Emily had been questioned by the police, spending 2 hours in interrogation before they finally released her. He also let me know that the authorities had identified the shooter, but were waiting for him to return from out of state to avoid any tip-offs. While it was a slight relief to know they had a suspect, learning that Emily had shared information about him hit me hard. Alexander didn't have many other details, but knowing she recognized the shooter made my worst suspicions feel disturbingly real. After a quiet pause, he suggested I take a break somewhere, maybe a trip to the beach or even a quick Vegas getaway. The idea resonated with me. Alexander assured me he'd call if anything urgent came up before he left. A change of scenery felt like the right move. He stayed for about another hour, just talking, and while I initially thought he might be fishing for information, I soon realized he was simply there for company. As he got ready to leave, Alexander asked for my cell number, mentioning he'd like to stay updated on where I'd be. Alone again, I started thinking of potential destinations. Hawaii was tempting, but I didn't love the idea of a long flight. I tossed around a few ideas, but nothing felt right, and by the time I went to bed, I still hadn't settled on a place. The next morning, I checked in with my office. Everything was running smoothly without me, which was both a relief and a bit unsettling. My boss, Charlie, assured me I could take as long as I needed before returning. He casually asked how Emily was, but I dodged any mention of her ties to the shooting. Charlie then suggested I go to Vegas to relax, and when I hesitated, he offered me his house there. Charlie mentioned he hadn't stayed there in a while and asked if I'd mind keeping an eye on it during my stay. He even mentioned a Honda parked in the garage that I could use, and asked if I could restock the fridge with Heineken for his next visit. Gratefully, I accepted his offer, booked a flight for the following day, and called Emily's parents to let them know she could come by to collect her things. Her mother, Mary, pleaded with me to speak to Emily, but I couldn't bring myself to face her yet. When Mary hinted that maybe we could find a way to mend things, I snapped, reminding her that Emily's lover had been the one to shoot me. After hanging up, regret crept in about my tone, but I couldn't see a path to reconciliation with Emily. Later that evening, Charlie dropped off the keys to his Vegas home, mentioning I'd love the place. I awkwardly clarified that Emily wouldn't be joining me and asked him to keep my plans under wraps. He promised he would. Afterward, I filled Alexander in on my plans. He urged me to keep my location private until the shooter was in custody, expressing unease about the delay in the arrest. He also advised me to avoid any contact with Emily until things calmed down. Before we wrapped up the call, he mentioned that the assistant district attorney would soon question Emily again and asked if I had anything that might help the case. Unfortunately, I had nothing useful to offer. Emily had never given me any reason to distrust her until now. Alexander reassured me, reminding me I'd need resilience for what lay ahead. Before he left, we acknowledged that this ordeal, despite everything, had brought us closer as friends. We ended on a lighter note, joking about the perks of having a cop as a friend. After our talk, I began packing lightly, knowing I wasn't physically up for carrying a heavy suitcase. I stuck to essentials: socks, underwear, a few pairs of pants, a pair of shorts, and 6 shirts. With a washer and dryer at Charlie's, I didn't need much, and I could buy anything else once I arrived in Vegas. By 10:30 the next morning, I was in a cab headed west along Charleston Boulevard under the sweltering 101-degree sun. Charlie had described his place as small, but at 3,000 square feet, it was more impressive than I'd expected. The outside was a pristine white stucco with a red tile roof, and the double red oak doors with stained glass at the entrance added an elegant touch. Inside, high-tech controls handled everything from the air conditioning to the security system. For a brief moment, the house lifted my spirits. I thought, Emily would love this. But almost instantly, the familiar sadness and anger settled back in. Left alone, the credit for which I gave to her, I decided a bit of shopping might help pass the time. The old Honda in the garage roared to life with no issues, its engine still smooth as ever. I headed to a familiar mall nearby, picking up essentials for the week: groceries, beverages, and an ample supply of beer. Back at home, drained from the outing, I unpacked everything, then threw together a sandwich for a quick bite. Once I'd eaten, I changed into swim trunks, catching a glimpse of my scars in the mirror, a sight that always stirred a familiar unease. To avoid any neighborly stares, I slipped on a shirt before stepping outside. But the heat was suffocating, and I soon gave in, taking a cooling dive into the pool. Relaxed and refreshed, I sank into a lounge chair, nearly nodding off until my phone rang. I picked it up. "Matthew," came the voice. It was Alexander. "What's up?" I asked, surprised by the call. "I have a few questions for you if you're free," he replied. "Go ahead," I said, curious about his questions. "What can you tell me about Sarah Bowden?" he asked, seemingly out of the blue. "Sarah Bowden?" I repeated, a bit thrown. "Why is she relevant here?" "I was hoping you could explain that," he replied. I gave it a moment's thought. "She was someone I knew in college." "Did you two date?" he continued. "Yes, we went out a few times," I confirmed. "Were you intimate with her?" Alexander asked, point blank. I felt a flicker of irritation. "Does that really matter?" "It's just part of the inquiry," he said evenly. "So, did you?" "No, we didn't," I replied curtly. "Did things end because she lost interest?" he pressed. "No, it wasn't like that," I replied. "We just realized it wouldn't work, and ended it." "Did you stay in touch afterward?" he asked. "For a while, nothing serious," I replied. "Why all this interest in someone I dated so long ago?" My patience was waning. "Something came up related to the case," he explained. "Were you seeing your wife then?" "No, I hadn't met Emily at that point," I clarified. "All right, so tell me how you and Sarah first met," Alexander continued. I took a steady breath, recalling the night. "It was a Saturday. I stopped to refuel, and this car pulled up with a guy shouting at a girl inside. When I went inside to pay, he followed me. While he was inside, she approached me and asked for a ride. She had a bruise on her cheek, so I told her to get in. We drove to a Denny's, talked for a bit. She said he wasn't a boyfriend, just someone she'd been out with twice, and he'd hit her that night." "Do you remember his name?" Alexander asked. "No, she never said," I replied. "Anything else about Sarah that stands out?" he pressed. "No, not really. I haven't heard from her since college," I answered, though a faint memory tugged at me. "Actually, wait. Emily asked about her maybe a year ago." "What made Emily bring her up?" Alexander asked, clearly intrigued. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "It was after she'd come back from Germany. Out of nowhere, she asked if I knew a Sarah Bowden." "And how did you respond?" Alexander asked. "I told her the truth, that we'd met in college," I said. "Did Emily offer any explanation for asking?" Alexander's eyes remained fixed, his voice measured. "She mentioned someone suggested it but didn't drop a name," I answered. Why was she in Germany anyway? Alexander asked, his head tilting just slightly. She went as a supervisor for a school trip, I clarified. Who else was with her? He continued, pressing for more. I listed the teachers and other chaperones who'd gone along, noticing a slight change in Alexander's expression as he listened. Why didn't you go with her? He asked next. I had to cancel last minute for a work conference in Denver, I replied. Did she ever bring up Sarah after that? He asked. No, I responded, a faint discomfort surfacing. That's everything? Alexander's tone stayed even. Yes, at least I hope so, I replied, sensing a layer of tension in his voice. What does that mean? I asked, trying to interpret his reaction. Look, I'm not sure Sarah Bowden is involved, but it's something I need to look into, Alexander said cautiously. I just hope you're being entirely transparent with me. A spark of irritation flared. Are you saying I'm hiding something? I thought we were on the same side here, I replied, feeling defensive. We are, Matthew, he answered, keeping his tone controlled and professional. But I'm a cop, and I have my job to do. This mess has somehow pulled Sarah in, and I just can't see how it all fits, I muttered, feeling uneasy. For the rest of the weekend, I sought distraction, swimming, reading, anything to get Alexander's questions about Sarah out of my mind. Why had she suddenly become relevant, and what exactly was he suspecting? By Monday, I decided on a new routine. I started walking 2 miles each morning and swimming laps in the afternoon, waiting for news from Alexander about the shooter's arrest. But no updates came. After lunch, I called Emily's dad. Hey, George, how's Emily holding up? I asked. Did you know she quit her job? George's reply threw me off. She quit? Why on earth would she do that? She was worried about rumors, but honestly, I think there's more to it, he answered. Emily had always loved teaching, so this felt like a heavy blow. Let her know I'm sorry she felt she had to leave, I said softly, before ending the call. Alexander's strange questions about Sarah Bowden echoed in my mind as I tried to untangle her role in this whole situation. By Wednesday, Alexander still hadn't called. Instead, my phone rang with a call from Charlie. How's the new place treating you? He asked with a light tone. It's great, though maybe a bit more spacious than I expected. I laughed. We chuckled, but then his tone shifted, serious now. A detective dropped by this morning, asking questions about you. A wave of dread hit. What was he looking for? He asked where you were. I told him, Charlie said. Only then did I realize I hadn't told Alexander exactly where I'd been staying. I reassured Charlie and ended the call, but a sense of unease settled in. That evening, I headed over to Treasure Island Casino, hoping a few hours at the blackjack table would help me unwind. Around 9 o'clock, I returned home to find a missed call and voicemail from Alexander, asking me to call back. After a quick snack, I returned his call. Hey, you asked me to call? Where have you been? Alexander's tone was sharp. Do I have to check in with you constantly? I snapped, irritation rising. Sorry, but we have a problem. Our suspect didn't make it back from Denver. He slipped away at LAX, Alexander said. Shock rolled over me. So, the guy who shot me is still out there? Yes. And we're not sure if he knows we're onto him, Alexander replied. Any chance Emily might have warned him? As unease crept over me, I tried to shrug off the tension tightening in my chest. Do you really believe she's safe? We're confident, but we're still keeping tabs on her, Alexander replied, then added, How are you holding up? I scoffed, the frustration slipping into my words. Maybe I'd feel better if you focused on catching him rather than digging through my past. Without warning, Alexander's tone shifted to a sharper edge. Matthew, get out of the house. Now. I froze. Why? Do you think he's actually coming here? There's a chance he's already there, he warned, his voice carrying a gravity that tightened my throat. Who is this guy anyway? I forced the words out, feeling an eerie chill crawl over me. Alexander hesitated briefly before responding. Aiden Thompson. Emily's gym teacher? I repeated, stunned. I barely know him. There's more to their connection than we initially thought, he confessed, his tone grave. We're still piecing things together. Did Emily mention anything specific? I pressed, dread coiling within me. I can't disclose that yet, he answered firmly. But you need to leave. Call me as soon as you're somewhere safe. The urgency hit me like a punch, the realization sinking in. He could make it from LA to Vegas faster than I wanted to admit. I looked around the dimly lit room and finally conceded. All right, I'm leaving now, I replied, ending the call. After powering down my phone, I cut the lights, leaving the house in shadow. I moved to the windows, scanning outside for anything unusual. A parked car, a figure lurking. Nothing. But the thought of Aiden Thompson waiting nearby gnawed at me. With keys in hand, I slipped into the garage, quietly opening the door just enough to back Charlie's Honda out. As I pulled away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, feeling an unshakable tension in the pit of my stomach. A few blocks down, my heart sank as I spotted a silver Ford Explorer with California plates heading toward Charlie's house. The timing felt far too precise to be a coincidence. I quickly veered onto the I-15, pushing back toward LA in hopes of throwing him off my trail. Maintaining a steady speed, I reached the I-10 and finally made it to Burbank by 2:30 in the morning, drained. I checked into a modest hotel near the airport, eager to hide out and gather my thoughts. In the dim hotel room, my mind wouldn't rest. Was Aiden Thompson truly tracking me? Could he still be in Vegas? Or was he already in LA? Questions spiraled, but none of it made sense. If he and Emily were involved, why not end it without dragging me into this nightmare? After a sleepless night, I phoned Alexander in the morning, filling him in on my whereabouts and mentioning the Explorer I'd seen. What kind of car? He asked. A silver Ford Explorer, I replied. His voice shifted. That sounds like his. Thompson's car was traced to LAX. He parked it there before flying to Denver. He was seen leaving the lot late Sunday night. So he's back in LA? I asked, tension rising in my voice. Seems so. Where exactly are you staying? Hotel in Burbank, room 254, I told him. Within 45 minutes, Alexander was there. He entered, opened his briefcase, and slid a photo across the table. Do you recognize this man? I studied the grainy image of a man with dark hair behind the wheel of a car. He was big, intimidating, and entirely unfamiliar. Is that Aiden Thompson? I asked, glancing up. Alexander nodded. Yes. I don't know him, I said, unease prickling my skin. Then, with a grim expression, he placed a videotape on the table. You're not supposed to see this yet, he murmured. But I think it's time. Don't mention this to anyone. My curiosity flared. What's on it? With a growing sense of dread, I questioned Alexander, seeking clarity on his cryptic comment. You'll understand soon enough, he replied, and promptly left. Alone, I reached out to the front desk to request a VCR. When it was brought to my room, I set it up, hovering for a moment above the play button. Finally, I pressed it, and after a flicker of static, the screen displayed a somber gray room where Emily and Jim were seated. Emily appeared stoic, her hands resting motionless on the table before her. Her clothes struck a familiar note. She was wearing the same outfit from the night she left with Jim. This video must have been recorded back then. A door to the left soon opened, and a man in gray slacks and a neatly pressed white shirt entered the room. Good evening, Mrs. Anderson. I'm Detective Davis, and I'll be handling this interview, he announced as he settled into the chair across from Emily. Before we start, would you like a drink or perhaps a brief pause? Emily shook her head, her voice barely reaching him as she said, "No, I'm fine." "All right, let's begin," Davis replied, leaning slightly forward. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened on Friday, August 8th. Please be honest." Emily nodded slightly, her expression still unreadable. "Were you in the house when your husband was shot?" he asked in a steady tone. "Yes," Emily replied softly, her eyes falling to the table. "Who fired the gun?" It, it was an accident," she whispered, her voice faint. "Who pulled the trigger?" Davis repeated, his tone hardening slightly. Emily took a shaky breath. "Aiden Thompson," she admitted, the name striking me like a sudden chill. "And who is Aiden Thompson?" Davis pressed. After a moment's hesitation, Emily murmured, "He's a gym teacher at my school." Davis continued, "And where were you when the shooting happened?" She answered quietly, "I was hiding. In the closet." Detective Davis leaned in, his voice taking a sharper edge. "How can you be so sure it was an accident if you were hiding in the closet?" Emily looked up, her voice faltering. "Aiden told me so." Davis scrutinized her. "Walk me through the events of that day." "We were in my bedroom when we heard the front door open. I panicked because Matthew wasn't supposed to be home then. I reached for my phone to call for help, but Aiden urged me to stay quiet. He went downstairs to check and came back, saying someone was in the house and told me to hide in the closet. Just moments later, I heard gunshots. My heart stopped. I feared Aiden had been shot." Emily's voice quivered as she continued. "Aiden opened the closet door a moment later. He looked rattled and mumbled that it was an accident. I followed him into the hallway, and he explained he thought Matthew had something in his hand, a tool, and that he panicked and fired. That's when I saw Matthew at the base of the stairs." Her voice broke as she tried to hold back tears. "I told Aiden to call for help, but he refused, saying it was already too late. He told me we needed to stage it to look like a robbery. While I checked on Matthew, Aiden began tearing apart the family room. I couldn't wait any longer. I dialed emergency services myself, but I was put on hold," she said, her voice shaky. Davis maintained his gaze on her. "What was Aiden doing as you were on the phone?" Emily's face turned pale as she recalled. "He just stood there telling me to stick to our story. He warned that if the police went after him, they'd come after me too." "And after that?" Davis asked. Emily's eyes shifted sideways as she recollected. "Something strange happened. He leaned over Matthew and murmured something. I think he said, 'It's for Sarah,' but I can't be sure." Davis furrowed his brow. "Who is Sarah, do you think?" After a pause, Emily suggested, "Possibly Sarah Bowden, someone Matthew once dated in college. Aiden asked me once if Matthew knew her." Detective Davis quickly noted the name Sarah Bowden and refocused on Emily. "Now tell me more about your relationship with Aiden Thompson." Emily grew visibly tense, her voice hardening as she replied, "He's just a colleague," averting her eyes once more to the table. As Davis scrutinized her, the suspicion in his eyes sharpened. "What was he doing in your bedroom?" Emily paused, a tremor in her voice. He followed me upstairs." Davis didn't let it go. "And what was he even doing at your place that day?" After a steadying breath, Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We had lunch with some other teachers, and then I went home to change. I'd spilled sauce on my blouse, so he offered to drive me." "And that's how he ended up upstairs with you?" Davis pressed, his tone relentless. "Yes," she answered softly, her voice fading. Davis leaned back slightly, clearly unconvinced. "And just happened to have a beer mug with him?" Emily nodded, her voice barely a murmur. "He bought it for me when he was in Germany, said it was a memento from his trip, something that would remind me of us." Davis scowled, unfazed. "So why bring it upstairs?" Her voice quivered as she replied, He was trying to remind me of the past, of things from Germany." She stopped, her emotions breaking through as she admitted, He tried to seduce me. Her voice finally cracked, and tears streamed down her face. Davis's gaze hardened. Did you sleep with him? His words cut through her sobs. No, she replied firmly, shaking her head. I didn't. Davis's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer. Would that still be true if your husband hadn't walked in? No, Emily repeated, her voice stronger with a hint of finality. Davis wasn't finished. So what made Thompson believe you'd be interested in him? Her voice trembled. He kept bringing up Germany, kept trying to pull me back there, to manipulate me, to make me think I should, she said, her voice faltering. And why would he believe you'd go along with it? Davis pressed, his tone unyielding. Emily's distress grew more apparent, and Jim, her lawyer, gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But Davis kept pushing, his questions relentless. Then, abruptly, everything changed. A sudden shift, a movement. I felt it immediately, an earthquake. The ground shuddered, and I quickly backed up, gripping the doorway of the bathroom as the tremors grew stronger. It had to be at least a 6 on the scale. A large window in the distance cracked, then shattered, sending glass shards into the parking lot below. A few seconds later, the power flickered out, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by the distant sounds of sirens and car alarms echoing in the city. I waited, hoping the lights would return. When they didn't, I unplugged the VCR and made my way to the front desk. My tape stuck inside. Mind if I borrow your VCR to get it out? I asked, pointing at the machine. The clerk nodded and motioned toward a covered area. We've got a generator over there. You can use it. Within minutes, I had the tape in my hand and headed home. On the way, I called Alexander. I'm on my way back. Power's out here too. Good timing, he said. I need to talk to you. I'll be there in 30 minutes. By the time I reached the house, darkness enveloped everything. I turned off the headlights, took the tape, and moved cautiously toward the front door. The night was disorienting, and I stumbled more than once. Finally, kneeling by the door, I fumbled with the lock. I can't see anything, I muttered. Oddly, shutting my eyes seemed to help as I found the keyhole by feel alone. Once inside, the darkness felt even heavier. I knew there was a flashlight in the kitchen pantry, so I edged along the walls, hands feeling my way forward. A sudden unease prickled through me. Something felt wrong. I froze, catching a strange scent. A mix of sweat and whiskey lingered in the air. Is someone here? I whispered, my pulse racing. A thought flashed through my mind. Thompson. Could he have used the blackout to get inside? Moving carefully, I took measured steps toward the pantry. As I reached for the door, I felt a wave of heat and a faint breath close to my face. Hey, Matthew. Thompson's voice slurred, his breath thick with the stench of whiskey. I stopped, every sense on high alert as he loomed close, his breath hot and sour just inches from me. In an instant, I shoved him hard and dodged out of the way. He stumbled, caught off guard, and the deafening blast of a gunshot filled the air. A brilliant flash left me momentarily blinded, while the booming sound jarred my nerves. I ducked into the pantry, listening to shots ripping through the space around me. Frantically, I reached for a flashlight on the upper shelf, clutching it tightly as I pressed myself into the corner. Why fight it, Matthew? Thompson's voice slithered with malice. I've been waiting so long for this. Just give in. I held my breath, forcing down the fury rising inside me as his taunts continued. Emily and I have plans once you're out of the picture, he sneered, his words igniting a surge of rage I struggled to control. After a pause, he added, almost casually, Did you know she visited me in Germany? She came to me willingly. The words stung, but I refused to show it. He leaned in, calling mockingly from the other side of the pantry door. Where are you hiding, Matthew? Emily wants us to be together. She wants you out of the way. Those words shattered my restraint. With a burst of adrenaline, I crashed into the door, sending Thompson reeling back into the dining room table as we fought for dominance. I managed to pin down his right arm, but I'd forgotten he was left-handed. His left elbow jabbed into my side, sending a sharp wave of pain through me. I swung the flashlight wildly, landing a solid hit. He screamed, and the flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering across the floor. Thompson groaned, struggling to stand. Through clenched teeth, he growled, "You're going to regret this, Matthew." Scrambling, I grabbed my phone and dialed Alexander as fast as I could. "Thompson's here! Get here now!" I yelled into the phone. Thompson sneered at me. "They'll never make it in time. Emily and I will be in Sao Paulo before anyone arrives." Suddenly, an idea struck. "Oh, and Sarah mentioned she couldn't stand you. Said you were terrible in bed." That hit him hard. "Don't you dare mention Sarah!" he roared. As my phone's light dimmed, the room plunged into darkness, and Thompson lunged, hurling me across the room as he reached for his gun. Keeping low, I braced myself, realizing the next shot could be the end. Just then, beams of light from police flashlights cut through the darkness. Thompson raised his gun, but before he could act, 3 shots rang out, and he dropped to the floor. Officers stormed in, securing him. "He's alive," one officer noted. Alexander rushed over to me. "Are you hurt?" "Not badly," I managed, still shaken. "Thanks for getting here in time." "Who fired the shots?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "All of us," Alexander replied. As Thompson was loaded into an ambulance, I recounted the events to 3 different detectives, each one reminding me how close I'd come. When the police finally left, Alexander and I settled in the family room. "Why was he after me?" I asked, still trying to piece everything together. Alexander took a moment to gather his thoughts. "It was an obsession. He thought you'd taken something he couldn't bear to lose. Revenge consumed him. But it wasn't really about Emily, was it?" I suspected the truth but needed him to confirm it. "No," he said. "Emily was just his pawn. The real reason was Sarah Bowden." I exhaled, trying to process it. "Sarah?" Alexander nodded. "Yes. She came up during Emily's questioning, so I tracked her down. She's remarried now, lives in Phoenix. I spoke to her before coming here." A growing sense of unease washed over me as I asked, "What did she say?" Alexander's gaze shifted before he replied. "She admitted she knew you, confirming your brief dating history, exactly as you described it. Then, I mentioned Thompson." After a pause, he went on. "She confessed that Aiden was the man she'd been with at the gas station that night. They hadn't kept in touch for months afterward, but eventually he reached out to apologize and asked to see her. She made the mistake of letting him into her apartment. Things started off calmly, but his demeanor quickly darkened, and he insisted she was his. When she attempted to call the police, he threatened her, warning that if he ever saw her with someone else, there would be severe consequences for both of them." Alexander continued. "She didn't think the threat applied to you specifically since she wasn't dating anyone at the time. Shortly afterward, she moved to Phoenix, hoping he wouldn't follow her." I let out a long breath, processing this new information. "And is she safe now?" Alexander nodded. "As far as I know, yes." A silence fell between us as I absorbed the details. Eventually, I broke it, asking, "What about Thompson?" Alexander's expression turned somber. "His chances don't look good. By the time they reached the hospital, he had already slipped into a coma." Mixed emotions stirred inside me, relief tempered by an absence of any true sense of victory. Alexander's voice drew me back. "Sorry, but your home is under investigation again. The whole area needs to remain undisturbed, but they should finish quickly. Internal affairs will be arriving tomorrow, as officers were involved in the incident." "Do I have to go somewhere else?" I asked, dreading the thought of finding a hotel. "No, just avoid disturbing anything in the kitchen," he responded. "You should have full access again by midday tomorrow." He glanced at me with a small smirk. "Did you manage to finish watching that video?" I shook my head, remembering the interruption. "No, the earthquake cut me off." A soft chuckle escaped him. "Right, I almost forgot. Just don't tell anyone I gave you a copy. When you're done, destroy it." The weight of the situation settled heavily on me as I looked into Alexander's eyes. "And what will happen to Emily?" He exhaled deeply. "That's up to the prosecutor now. If she's been truthful, she might escape charges." We both rose, and he reached for his coat. "I'll let you know if there are any updates about your wife." "Thanks, Alexander," I replied, attempting a light smile. "I owe you a whiskey." He grinned. "Make it two," he replied, then headed out. Left alone in the family room, Thompson's words replayed in my mind. Could any of this actually be true? Emily had mentioned the German beer glass, but had she really been involved with him? I wanted to believe she hadn't, yet doubt was creeping in. Too exhausted to finish the video, I decided to go to bed. My sleep was restless, filled with chaotic fragments of the recent events. Early the next morning, the doorbell woke me. Two men in brown suits stood outside, introducing themselves as detectives from Internal Affairs. "We're here to examine the scene of the shooting," one said. "Has anything in the kitchen been moved?" "No," I assured him. After recounting the events one more time, they proceeded with their examination, while I took a shower. When I returned, they were finishing up. "You're free to clean now," one of them informed me before they left. I arranged for a cleaning service, though they wouldn't be available until Monday. It would have to do. At around 11 a.m., I noticed the power had come back on, so I thought of resuming Emily's interview. But when I went to grab the videotape, it was gone. I turned the house upside down, checked every drawer, and even searched my car. The tape was nowhere to be found, and a surge of panic set in. Had I somehow lost it in the scuffle with Thompson? Or had Internal Affairs picked it up, mistaking it for crucial evidence? Either way, I knew it was essential to inform Alexander. The rest of the day passed in a haze, a strange hollowness settling over me as I struggled to accept the tape's disappearance. Without it, I felt like I had lost my sense of direction. The silence in the house felt overwhelming, amplifying how alone I truly was. My mind kept wandering back to Emily, wondering if there was still a chance for us. That evening, Alexander dropped by, and as we sipped our drinks, he informed me that Thompson had passed away earlier in the afternoon. Relief mixed with unease within me. Alexander went on to say that the ADA had decided not to press any charges against Emily. She had been fully cooperative and even passed a polygraph test, convincing them of her integrity. I nodded, still deep in thought about Emily. As Alexander stood to leave, he offered one last piece of advice. "Take your time, but remember that she's not to blame for what happened." The next morning, I went to visit Emily at her parents' home. Her father, George, greeted me warmly, leading me inside to where Emily sat, looking exhausted and tear-streaked. "I was so worried about you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," I murmured, hesitating. "I just couldn't talk yesterday." "Did you hear about Thompson's death?" I asked gently. She nodded, tears welling up. "I'm not crying for him, Matthew. I'm crying for everything he's done to us." Before I could respond, Mary chimed in. "The district attorney's office called yesterday. They've decided not to charge Emily." "I know," I replied, glancing at Emily. "It's good news, really." "Isn't it?" Mary asked, sounding hopeful. "Yes, it is," I answered, though I couldn't shake the heavy uncertainty over what it all meant for us. Emily moved closer, her voice soft. "Can I come home with you?" I shook my head, feeling conflicted. "No, I'm not going home just yet." She looked at me, confusion in her eyes. "Then where are you going?" "I have to take Charlie's car to Las Vegas," I explained. Emily blinked, clearly puzzled. "But Charlie lives in Sherman Oaks. Why do you need to drive his car to Vegas?" I gently held her face, meeting her gaze. "I'll explain on the way. I want you to come with me." She wiped her tears and wrapped her arms around me. Turning to George, I said, "George, I need a favor. There are cleaners coming to the house on Monday. Could you let them in?" "Of course," he replied. What time? Around noon, I said, feeling a sense of finality as I added, Emily and I should get going. As we were leaving, Emily mentioned she needed to pick up some things from home. I already packed what you'll need, I told her. She looked at me, surprised. So, you knew you'd be bringing me along? You're my wife. Why would I go without you? I kissed her forehead. For the first part of the drive, she was quiet. Then she finally asked, Did you really pack all my things? Only the essentials, I replied with a grin. Underwear, sandals, heels, and that black dress you love. As our conversation continued, I offered a calming reassurance, saying, We can always replace whatever we need. Emily responded with a gentle smile, pressed a warm kiss to my cheek, and soon we found ourselves slipping back into our familiar, easy rhythm. Yet, after some time, a shift in Emily's expression caught my attention. A weight seemed to settle in her eyes. I leaned in, my voice soft. Is something on your mind? Her voice thick with emotion, she started. Matthew, I'm truly sorry for everything. Please believe me when I say I love you, and nothing ever happened with Aiden. I don't want you to lose faith in me over this. Ask me anything. I promise I'll be honest. After a pause, I asked, Was it you who broke the beer glass? A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she slowly nodded. Yes, it was me, she admitted quietly. I nodded slightly in response. I had already figured that out, I murmured. Relief softened her face. I love you, Matthew. I trust you, and I just want to leave this behind us. Let's enjoy these next few days together without any worries, she whispered. When we arrived at Charlie's place in Vegas, Emily took in the surroundings, looking pleased. This is way better than one of those packed hotels on the Strip, she commented with a smile. Our day drifted peacefully by the pool, and later that evening, she prepared a simple, thoughtful meal, creating a warm, intimate setting. The connection between us felt renewed, though I knew others might question how I could trust her again. After the investigators left on Friday, I came across an old videotape tucked away in the pantry. To my surprise, it was a recording of Emily's police interview. I watched intently, taking in every detail of her conversation with Detective Davis. In the video, Davis questioned her about Aiden Thompson and any advances he might have made. Emily explained they were both chaperones on a trip to Germany, and on the last day, Aiden had given her a beer mug she'd admired as a gesture of thanks. Though she knew she probably shouldn't accept it, she did, thinking I would like it. She went on to explain that later that evening, after some drinks, Aiden had kissed her, and for an instant, she had returned the kiss. But she quickly realized the mistake, pushed him away, and made it clear there was nothing further. Hearing her recount this incident felt like a kind of reassurance. Did Mr. Thompson leave you alone after that? Davis asked calmly. Mostly, yes, she replied softly. He apologized the next day, blaming it on the alcohol, and respected my boundaries after that. Davis then pressed her. So, you're saying you never slept with Mr. Thompson? Emily's response was resolute. No, I love my husband, and I would never betray him. Davis continued. When you came back, what did you tell your husband about the mug Mr. Thompson gave you? Emily confessed. I told him I had bought it myself, and when I saw how much Matthew liked it, I felt guilty for not telling the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Did Mr. Thompson suggest an affair after that trip? Davis questioned. He flirted occasionally, but he never pushed any boundaries again, at least not until the day of the shooting, Emily said, her voice beginning to falter. Davis's tone hardened. Why do you call it an accident, Mrs. Anderson? Mr. Thompson shot your husband with intention. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she shook her head in disbelief. No, I can't believe he'd do that on purpose, she whispered, her voice cracking. Davis leaned in, unyielding. Mrs. Anderson, were you hiding in the closet when the gunshots went off? Emily gave a faint nod. Yes, she whispered. What did you hear? Davis asked. A A loud bang, followed by two quieter shots after a short pause, she replied, her voice barely holding steady. Do you know why there might have been a pause between the shots? Davis's brow creased in thought. Emily shook her head, clearly puzzled. No, I never thought about it. Davis pressed on, his tone blunt. Mr. Thompson shot your husband in the chest, went downstairs and fired twice more. He clearly intended to kill your husband. With that, Emily broke down, and Jim reached over to comfort her. After a moment, Davis posed a final question. Is there any reason you can think of that would make Mr. Thompson want your husband dead? Barely able to find her voice, Emily shook her head. I can't understand why he would do this. Detective Davis's voice sharpened as he leaned forward, eyes intent. Is there any other reason you can think of that might explain why he fired on your husband? Emily hesitated, her voice dropping as she finally responded. Maybe it has something to do with Sarah Bowden. Intrigued, Davis pressed on, leaning closer. What gives you that impression? Emily paused, gathering herself before revealing. When we were in Germany, Aiden asked if I could find out whether Matthew remembered anyone named Sarah Bowden. He didn't explain his reason. Davis's tone grew more pointed. Did you bring her up with your husband? Yes, I asked him, Emily replied, her voice steady. Matthew mentioned he knew her briefly, back in his college days. Davis didn't let up. Did you tell him that Mr. Thompson had specifically mentioned her name? Emily's eyes shifted downward as she murmured, No, I didn't. Davis squinted, his gaze searching. Why not? Emily looked away, visibly uncomfortable, and muttered, I'm not sure. The detective changed direction slightly. Did you see Mr. Thompson after the shooting? She nodded. Once at the hospital. What did he want? Davis's curiosity was evident in his tone. Emily's voice grew even softer. He said he needed to talk to me, to check on Matthew. Davis's expression was unyielding. And what was the topic of this conversation? Emily's words wavered. He wanted to make sure I didn't tell anyone what really happened, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Detective Davis closed his notebook, ending the interview. Emily left with Jim, her posture weighed down by the encounter. Later, as I reviewed the tape, unease about Emily's role gnawed at me. That night, Alexander came by with an update. The district attorney had decided against pressing charges. I questioned him, and he explained that Emily's polygraph results had cleared her. There was no affair with Thompson. The beer mug incident had merely been Thompson's ill-conceived attempt to win her over. Learning that Emily herself had broken the mug shed light on her actions. The shattered glass likely symbolized her way of dealing with the guilt from the entire episode. This was the missing piece I'd needed. Knowing Emily had been the one to break the mug allowed me to consider closing this chapter. But if Thompson had been responsible, doubts would always linger. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.